2.4 seconds. That's how long it took for Nettie Graves to swing her arm, feel her palm crack against flesh and bone, and understand she hadn't just completed a dare, she'd declared war on a man who never forgave debts. The obsidian vault didn't erupt in laughter or gasps. It went silent. The kind of silence that happens when predators detect fresh blood in the water. She stepped back, adrenaline singing through her veins like champagne, expecting anger or maybe the satisfying shock of a humiliated alpha male. Instead, she found something that made her stomach drop 6 floors. Robert Homer's head turned back to face her with the measured precision of a gun being cocked, his jaw barely registering the impact that should have rattled his teeth. His eyes locked onto hers, not with rage, but with the dark, patient interest of a man who'd just discovered an unexpected piece on his chessboard. Cold. Certain. Absolute. He was built like old money and older violence, not the performative muscle of men who peacocked in boardrooms, but the contained power of someone who understood that real force didn't need to announce itself. His suit probably cost more than her car. The tattoos creeping up from his collar suggested it had been paid for in currencies that didn't involve banks. Around them, the bar's neon-soaked darkness felt suddenly smaller, the leather booths and crystal tumblers transformed from expensive set dressing into a cage she'd locked herself inside. Men in tailored suits had stopped mid-conversation, their faces carefully blank in the way of people who knew better than to witness what came next. Robert didn't move. Didn't speak. He simply watched her with the focus of a man who'd just decided exactly how, when, and where he'd collect what she now owed him. And Nettie Graves, who'd spent her entire legal career reading people like depositions, realized with crystalline horror that she'd just slapped the one man in this city who never, ever forgot a face. Before we begin, click subscribe, like this video and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more thrilling stories, and trust me, you won't want me to miss them. Now let's get into the story. The hangover had teeth. Nettie pressed 2 fingers against her temple as she reviewed the Hartman deposition, trying to ignore the way fluorescent light turned her corner office into an interrogation room. She'd earned this view, 23 floors above the city, glass and steel and a partnership track that had cost her every relationship she'd ever tried to maintain. Worth it, she told herself. Always worth it. Her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. Ms. Graves? There's a gentleman here without an appointment. He says you're expecting him. I'm not expecting anyone. Tell him to schedule through. The door opened anyway. Robert Homer walked into her office like he'd already purchased the deed, his presence immediately making the expansive room feel like a shoebox. Same suit. Different tie. The kind of calm that made Nettie's fight-or-flight instinct start placing bets on which would fail her first. 2 men flanked him, silent, expensive, and utterly unnecessary for anything legal. Ms. Graves. His voice was frost over gravel. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. She stood, muscle memory overriding panic. I don't know how you found my office, Mr. Homer. Robert Homer. He settled into the chair across from her desk without invitation, crossing one leg over the other with the ease of a man who'd never been told no. Though I imagine you've spent the weekend learning everything Google could tell you about me. How disappointing that must have been. I value my privacy. Nettie's hand drifted toward her phone. His eyes tracked the movement with the lazy interest of a cat watching a mouse consider its options. I wouldn't. Not a threat. A statement of fact. I'm here to discuss a business matter. Your firm owes Summit Capital $3.7 million. Poor investments in the Castellano development, I'm told. The note was sold yesterday. He withdrew a folder from his jacket, placed it on her desk with surgical precision. To me. The air left her lungs in a rush she tried desperately to disguise as a measured breath. Summit Capital. The debt her partners had sworn was being restructured, renegotiated, handled. That's between our managing partners and... Your managing partners left for the Caymans this morning. Retirement, they called it. Cowardice, I'd call it. He leaned forward, and Nettie caught the scent of expensive cologne and something darker underneath, gun oil, maybe, or just the particular musk of a man who made people disappear. Which means you, Ms. Graves, are now the firm's senior litigator. And I own every billable hour you have. She gripped the edge of her desk. This is extortion. This is business. His smile could have frozen oceans. You slapped me in front of men who believe respect is measured in blood. I could have taken your life. Instead, I'm taking your expertise. Consider it mercy. And if I refuse? Robert stood, buttoning his jacket with movements so controlled they looked choreographed. Then I'll liquidate the firm by Friday, and you can explain to 63 employees why they're unemployed because you were too proud to pay a debt. He paused at the door, glancing back with those calculating eyes. I'll expect you at my office tomorrow morning. 6 a.m. Wear something you can work in. Your previous wardrobe won't survive where we're going. Then he was gone, leaving only the folder and the sickening certainty that Nettie's perfectly constructed life had just been bought, paid for, and repurposed by a man whose patience was a weapon she couldn't fight. Robert's office wasn't in any building Nettie could find on a map. The car that collected her at dawn had tinted windows dark enough to break 3 traffic laws, and the driver hadn't spoken once during the 40-minute journey into industrial nowhere. When they finally stopped, it was at a warehouse that looked like it manufactured either artisanal furniture or felonies. Possibly both. This way, Ms. Graves. One of Robert's men, she'd mentally labeled him Scar, for the tissue running down his jaw, gestured toward a steel door that opened onto a freight elevator. The kind with gates instead of walls. The kind where you could see exactly how far you'd fall. They descended into what her mind categorized as basement, but her instinct screamed was something worse. The air changed, colder, heavier, carrying the copper tang of old pipes or fresh blood. She couldn't tell which. Didn't want to. The elevator opened onto a concrete space lit by hanging bulbs that turned everything the color of old bruises. Robert stood in the center like a maestro before an orchestra, except his musicians were 3 men zip-tied to chairs, and his stage was covered in plastic sheeting that crinkled obscenely with every movement. Ms. Graves. Prompt. I appreciate that. He didn't look at her, his attention fixed on the center captive, a man whose expensive suit couldn't hide the terror leaking from every pore. We're discussing a territory dispute. The West Side docks. My associate here believes he can operate independent of our arrangement. Robert, please, the man's voice cracked. It was a misunderstanding. We can. You can't. Robert's tone held all the warmth of a contract termination. But Ms. Graves can. Tell me, counselor, what's the legal terminology for breach of verbal agreement in a business partnership? Nettie's throat had gone sandpaper dry. This isn't a legal matter. Everything is a legal matter if you frame it correctly. He finally turned to face her, and she saw it then, the absolute zero of his expression. This wasn't anger. This was accounting. These men violated the terms of our partnership. One must maintain standards. Now, I need you to observe and afterward provide me with documentation that establishes my whereabouts elsewhere this evening. I believe the legal term is alibi. I won't. The gunshot cracked through the space before she could finish the sentence. The man in the center chair jerked once, then slumped, and Nettie's scream caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat, emerging as a choked gasp that tasted like bile. Robert handed the gun to Scar with the casual gesture of someone returning a borrowed pen. The other 2 will be released with a message. But this one? He stepped over the spreading darkness on the plastic, his shoes somehow remaining pristine. This one is a lesson about the cost of disloyalty. He approached Nettie, whose legs had decided they no longer understood the concept of standing. Your first assignment, Ms. Graves. I was at a charity gala tonight. You were there to discuss the firm's pro bono work. We had dinner. Salmon, I think. Perhaps creme brulee for dessert. Can you remember that? She couldn't speak. Couldn't move. Could only stare at the body that 60 seconds ago had been pleading for mercy. Can you remember that, Nettie? His voice dropped lower, intimate and terrible. Because those 63 employees at your firm are counting on your memory being very, very good. Her voice emerged as a whisper. Salmon. Creme brulee. Excellent. He smiled, and it was worse than the gunshot. Now let's go upstairs and put that brilliant legal mind to work. We have paperwork to fabricate. The estate announced itself through iron gates that probably cost more than most people's mortgages, curling into Baroque patterns that managed to look both elegant and threatening. Nettie watched them slide open with the smooth whisper of money that never had to ask permission for anything. This is temporary, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. 3 days. 3 days since the warehouse, since she'd typed up an alibi so airtight it could survive a federal investigation, since she'd become an accessory to murder with nothing but her signature and her silence. Of course. Robert's tone suggested he'd heard that particular lie before. Just until the current instability resolves itself. You've made enemies by association, Ms. Graves. Dangerous ones who don't particularly care about legal immunity or professional courtesy. The car rolled up a driveway that could have hosted a marathon. The house beyond looked like old European money had mated with modern security paranoia, all limestone and bulletproof glass, gardens manicured with the precision of a threat. Beautiful. Sterile. Absolutely a prison. Inside, the foyer soared 3 stories, dominated by a chandelier that threw fractured light across marble floors. A woman in a dark suit appeared from nowhere, her face professionally blank. Ms. Graves. I'm Mrs. Chen. I manage the household. Your quarters are in the East Wing. Mr. Homer has requested you remain on the property until further notice. Requested. Nettie tasted the word like poison. That's diplomatic. I prefer to think of it as employed. Robert's voice came from above. He descended the curved staircase with the measured pace of someone who knew everyone would wait. Your room has a view of the garden. I'm told it's quite calming. You'll also find a laptop, encrypted, naturally, and access to any legal databases you require. Consider this a remote office. Consider this kidnapping. Consider this alive. His eyes went flint hard. Park Jin-woo controls the West Side now that his brother is dead. He considers you a witness and a liability. The last woman he considered a liability was found in 3 separate dumpsters. He gestured toward the stairs. Mrs. Chen will show you to your room. Dinner is at 8. Attendance is not optional. Nettie's room was obscene in its luxury, California king bed, and sub-bathroom larger than her apartment's living room, walk-in closet already stocked with clothes in exactly her size. The laptop sat on an antique desk positioned to face floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked gardens where she counted 4 guards in the first 30 seconds. She tried the windows. Locked. Tried the door to the hallway. It opened, but the guard stationed 15 feet away glanced up from his phone with the lazy attention of someone paid to notice everything. The closet yielded designer labels she'd never been able to afford, silk blouses, tailored slacks, dresses that cost more than her student loans. A gilded cage's uniform. She touched a cashmere sweater, and her reflection in the mirror caught her off guard. Same face. Different eyes. These ones had watched a man die and done nothing. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. The guards change shifts at 3 a.m. East Wall has a blind spot. You have friends who want you safe. P. Nettie stared at the message, her pulse quickening. Escape. A way out. She glanced at the window, at the guards, at the laptop that was definitely monitoring her every keystroke. Then she deleted the text and sat on the bed, head in her hands, wondering if the person who sent it was trying to save her or test whether she'd try to run. In Robert Homer's world, she was learning, trust was just another word for trap. The restaurant was the kind of place where silence cost extra, private dining room, soundproofed walls, and staff trained to forget faces before they even left the building. Robert had chosen it deliberately, the way he chose everything, with calculation that looked like casualness to anyone foolish enough to miss the pattern. Nettie sat across from him, pushing overpriced risotto around her plate while trying not to think about how this had become her life. Dinner with a murderer. Talking about contract law over wine that cost more than justice. The door opened without warning. The man who entered moved like violence wrapped in Armani, his smile sharp enough to draw blood. He was older than Robert by a decade, his hair silvered at the temples, but he carried himself with the coiled energy of someone who'd never stopped proving he was the most dangerous person in any room. Bobby. The name dripped with mockery. I heard rumors you'd gone soft. Didn't believe them until now. Robert's expression didn't change, but Nettie felt the temperature drop. Park. You're interrupting dinner. Am I? Park Jin-woo circled the table like a shark scenting prey, his eyes sliding over Nettie with the assessment of someone appraising livestock. The ghost of Seoul, domesticated by a woman in a pencil skirt. Your father would be ashamed. My father is dead. Robert's voice could have etched glass. You should remember that before you invoke his name. Park laughed, the sound cruel and delighted. Dead because he got sentimental. Same disease you're catching. He leaned against the table, invasive and deliberate. Word on the street is you're keeping a pet lawyer. Playing house. The syndicate's starting to wonder if you've forgotten what business we're actually in. Robert stood with the fluid grace of something uncoiling. Nettie. Leave. Oh, let her stay. Park's smile widened. She should see what you really are. Unless you've forgotten? The movement was so fast Nettie almost missed it. Robert's hand closed around Park's throat, slamming him back against the wall hard enough to crack plaster. The older man clawed at Robert's grip, his face purpling, but Robert's expression remained absolutely calm, the focused attention of someone performing a familiar task. I haven't forgotten anything. Robert's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. I remember Seoul. I remember what you did to that family in Gangnam. I remember watching you beg my father for mercy you didn't deserve. His grip tightened. I also remember deciding you were more useful alive. But useful things become disposable when they malfunction. Park's eyes bulged, his expensive shoes scrabbling against marble for purchase that wasn't coming. Say it. Robert's tone never rose. Say you were wrong. The words came out strangled, desperate. Wrong. I was wrong. Robert released him, and Park collapsed to the floor, gasping. Robert straightened his cuffs with the same care he'd use after any minor interruption, then turned to address the two guards who'd materialized in the doorway, Park's men, frozen by the casual brutality of what they'd just witnessed. Mr. Park is leaving. If he contacts me again without invitation, remind him of tonight's lesson. Robert returned to his seat, picked up his wine glass, examined it in the light. With prejudice. The guards dragged their boss out, and the door closed with a whisper of expensive hinges. Robert finally looked at Nettie, who hadn't moved, hadn't breathed, couldn't process what she'd just seen. You should finish your dinner, he said calmly. The risotto's better warm. And Nettie realized, watching him take another sip of wine with steady hands, that she'd never really understood what the ghost of Seoul meant. Until now. The tribunal met in a basement that smelled like cigarettes and old grudges. Nettie descended concrete stairs behind Robert, her heels clicking in anxious rhythm against stone, while men in expensive suits watched her approach with the collective warmth of a firing squad sizing up their target. This is your solution? The voice belonged to a man built like a refrigerator, his Russian accent turning each word into a threat. A lawyer? We handle our own justice, Homer. Victor wants blood. Robert's tone suggested he was discussing the weather. I'm offering him due process. Unless the Bratva has abandoned the old ways entirely? The room was arranged like a perverse courtroom, long table for the bosses, single chair in the center for the accused, and absolutely nowhere for Nettie except in the kill zone between them. Robert's lieutenant, a man named Chen who'd apparently killed the wrong person's nephew, sat zip-tied and bleeding from a split lip. His eyes met hers with the desperate hope of someone watching their last card get played. Viktor Kozlov leaned forward, his rings catching the bare bulb's light. The old ways involved a bullet and a shallow grave. You want to pretend it's civilization? Fine. Your pet has 30 minutes to convince us Chen's life has value. Otherwise, we vote. Nettie's mouth had gone dry, but her trial instincts kicked in, the same ones that had won her 12 impossible cases and made partner before 40. She stepped forward, forcing her voice steady. Then let's establish facts. The deceased, Alexei Kozlov, initiated contact with Mr. Chen in disputed territory. Surveillance confirms this. My nephew was conducting business. Your nephew, Nettie interrupted, her courtroom authority overriding her terror, was moving synthetic opioids through a distribution network explicitly designated as neutral ground per the West Side Accord of 2019. I have the documentation. Which means Alexei violated territorial agreements before any violence occurred. The room went silent. Even Robert's expression registered something that might have been surprise. Victor's face darkened to the color of an ugly bruise. You accuse my blood. I'm establishing precedent. Nettie pulled out her phone, displayed the contract she'd found in Robert's files during 72 hours of desperate research. Every boss in this room signed this agreement. Neutral zones exist to prevent exactly this kind of escalation. Chen acted in defense of established treaty. Your nephew's death, while regrettable, was the consequence of his own violation. She could feel Robert's eyes on her, calculating, reassessing. The other bosses shifted in their seats, a man in a Yakuza pin, another whose tattoos suggested triad affiliation, a woman in Chanel whose diamond choker probably cost more than assassinations. The girl makes a point. The Yakuza boss spoke softly, his English impeccable. Precedent matters. We cannot enforce agreements we ignore when convenient. This is bullshit. Victor slammed his fist on the table. Political theater. This is the old ways. The woman's voice cut through like a knife through butter. We established rules so we wouldn't destroy each other. If we abandon them for revenge, we're just thugs with expensive suits. She looked at Nettie with something approaching respect. The lawyer's right. The nephew violated treaty. Chen's response was proportional. Victor's jaw worked like he was chewing glass, but he didn't argue. The vote, when it came, was 4-1 in Chen's favor. Robert stood, buttoning his jacket. Gentlemen. Lady. Always a pleasure. He placed his hand on the small of Nettie's back, possessive, protective, she couldn't tell which, and guided her toward the stairs. Behind them, Victor's voice carried. You've trained her well, Homer. But lawyers make poor soldiers when the real war comes. Robert didn't respond, but his hand pressed firmer against her spine, and Nettie understood she'd just passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. The syndicate's respect, she was learning, was just another form of ownership. The ledger didn't make sense. Nettie had been staring at it for 3 hours, cross-referencing shipment dates with police raids, and the pattern emerging made her stomach turn in ways that had nothing to do with the cold pizza congealing on Robert's desk. Every raid had happened exactly 48 hours after a shipment was logged. Every single one. That wasn't coincidence. That was coordination. She reached for her phone, then hesitated. It was 2 a.m, and Robert was in Shanghai dealing with a supply chain issue that involved either corrupted port officials or actual corruption of port officials. She'd stopped asking for clarification on these things. But this couldn't wait. Someone inside his organization was feeding information to law enforcement with the precision of a metronome. The office door opened, and Nettie nearly jumped out of her skin. Working late? Daniel Homer looked nothing like his brother except for the eyes, same dark calculation, but where Roberts held the patience of a glacier, Daniel's burned with the restless energy of someone perpetually measuring himself against a standard he'd never reach. He was younger by 3 years, dressed in designer casual that probably cost what Nettie used to make in a month, and he moved through Robert's private office like he owned it. Research. She closed the ledger reflexively. Couldn't sleep. Robert's got you working through the night now? He's always been a demanding bastard. Daniel poured himself whiskey from the bar cart, didn't offer her any. How's the golden cage treating you? I heard about the tribunal. Very impressive. Victor's still furious. Something in his tone made her skin prickle. How did you hear about that? I hear about everything. He smiled, and it was Robert's smile reflected in a funhouse mirror, almost right, but fundamentally wrong. I'm the younger brother. The overlooked one. People talk around me like I'm furniture. He took a long drink. Useful, being invisible. Nettie's hand drifted toward the ledger, but Daniel's eyes tracked the movement with predatory focus. What are you really doing here, Ms. Graves? In the middle of the night. Going through financial records you shouldn't have access to. He set down his glass with deliberate care. Looking for something? Just familiarizing myself with. Familiarizing. He laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. Robert always did have a talent for recruiting talented people. Smart people. People who asked dangerous questions. He moved closer, and Nettie's chair suddenly felt like a trap. Did you find what you were looking for? Her heart hammered against her ribs. I don't know what you mean. The leaks. Daniel said it casually, like discussing weather. You found the pattern. I can see it in your face. That look, the one that says you've just uncovered something that changes everything. He leaned against the desk, blocking her exit. You're wondering who would be stupid enough to feed intelligence to the police. Who would risk Robert's wrath for what? Money? Immunity? Why are you telling me this? Because you're smart enough to understand leverage. His voice dropped lower, intimate and threatening. Robert's getting careless. Sentimental. Keeping you around like some kind of pet project instead of handling you the way he handles problems. The organization sees it. The other families see it. He's vulnerable, and vulnerability in our world is terminal. Nettie forced herself to meet his eyes. So you're staging a coup? I'm ensuring continuity of leadership when the inevitable happens. Daniel straightened, adjusted his cuffs in a gesture so similar to Robert's it was almost parody. The question is whether you're smart enough to pick the winning side. Or loyal enough to bet everything on a man who's already lost. Robert will kill you. Robert won't see it coming until it's too late. He's too busy playing house with his lawyer. Daniel moved toward the door, paused. When the police come, and they will come, with warrants bearing Robert's name, you'll have a choice. Cooperate and walk away clean, or go down with him. Choose wisely, Ms. Graves. The door closed behind him with a whisper that sounded like a guillotine blade falling. Nettie sat frozen, staring at the ledger that had just become evidence of fratricide, and reached for her phone with trembling hands. Robert answered on the second ring, his voice rough with exhaustion or sleep. It's your brother, she said, and heard the silence that followed stretch into something vast and terrible. Daniel's the leak. The rain came down in sheets that turned the estate's windows into abstract art, each drop fracturing the garden lights into 1,000 smaller stars. Nettie found Robert in the conservatory at 3 a.m, surrounded by orchids that probably cost more than most people's cars, staring at nothing with the focus of someone watching ghosts only he could see. You should be sleeping. His voice carried no accusation, just statement of fact. So should you. She stayed in the doorway, uncertain of her welcome. They'd barely spoken since Shanghai, since her phone call about Daniel had sent Robert into a silence so complete it felt like the absence of oxygen. The raids in 48 hours. Chen's moving the evidence, Anne. I know the timeline. He still didn't look at her. Daniel's arrangements are predictable. He's always been predictable. That was his weakness. Was? Is. Robert corrected himself, but something in the hesitation made Nettie's chest tighten. Old habits. My father used to say I spoke about Daniel in past tense even when we were children. Like I'd already written his ending. She moved closer, drawn by something in his tone she'd never heard before, not vulnerability exactly, but proximity to it. What happens when the police come? They'll find a warehouse full of legitimate imports and a very confused informant who can't explain why his intelligence was so catastrophically wrong. Robert finally turned, and the conservatory's ambient light caught the side of his face, revealing what the careful tailoring and strategic angles usually hid, a scar that ran from his left ear down beneath his collar, the tissue raised and deliberately brutal. Daniel will be discredited. Probably arrested for filing false reports. The syndicate will consider the matter handled. You're not going to kill him. No. The word came out flat, and somehow that made it worse than any threat. I'm going to do something far more cruel. I'm going to let him live with the knowledge that he failed. Robert touched the scar absently, a gesture that seemed unconscious. My father gave me this. I was 17. He found out I'd been skimming from the Yakuza shipments to pay for my mother's cancer treatment. Treatment he'd deemed wasteful spending, since she was going to die anyway. Nettie's breath caught. Robert. He used a broken bottle. Held me down in front of the entire organization and explained that mercy was a luxury we couldn't afford. That sentiment was a disease that would kill us all. Robert's hand dropped, and his eyes found hers across the darkness. My mother died 3 weeks later. Never knew what I'd done. What it cost. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. I became what he wanted. The Ice King. The Ghost. The man who never flinched, never hesitated, never let anything as weak as love dictate his choices. He moved closer, and Nettie could smell the whiskey on his breath, see the fractures in his carefully maintained control. And then you walked into my bar, slapped me like I was nothing special, and looked at me like I was just another asshole in an expensive suit. I was drunk and stupid. You were honest. His hand came up, fingers barely brushing her jaw where she'd struck him that night. Everyone in my world either fears me or wants to use me. You just wanted to win a dare. His laugh was bitter and somehow young. I couldn't decide if I wanted to kill you or keep you. Which did you choose? Both. Neither. I still haven't decided. Robert's thumb traced her cheekbone with the careful precision of someone handling something breakable. Daniel thinks I'm weak because of you. He's wrong. I'm terrified because of you. There's a difference. Nettie's heart hammered against her ribs. Terrified of what? Of wanting something I can't control. Can't buy. Can't solve with violence or money or carefully constructed alibis. His forehead touched hers, and the gesture was so unexpectedly gentle it made her throat tighten. My father would have killed you the night we met. Eliminated the variable. I put you in a gilded cage instead and told myself it was about debt collection. What is it about? The words came out barely above a whisper. I don't know. His honesty was more devastating than any lie. I just know that when you called me about Daniel, my first thought wasn't about the organization or the syndicate or even my own survival. It was whether you'd be safe when everything came apart. The rain continued its percussion against glass, and Nettie understood she'd just witnessed something rarer than any vulnerability, Robert Homer admitting he didn't have all the answers. That something in his perfectly controlled world had slipped beyond his grasp. She should have been terrified. Should have used this moment to run, to escape, to save herself from whatever inevitable tragedy this path led toward. Instead, she reached up and touched the scar her fingers could barely trace in the darkness, and felt his breath catch against her palm. Your father was wrong, she said quietly. Mercy isn't weakness. It's the hardest choice people like you ever make. Robert's arms closed around her then, and Nettie let herself be pulled into the embrace of a man who'd built empires on calculated cruelty, wondering when exactly her fear had transformed into this complicated, dangerous thing that felt terrifyingly close to loyalty. Or something even more foolish than that. The hangar smelled like jet fuel and expensive mistakes. Nettie stood beside Robert in the cavernous space, watching Daniel arrive with an entourage that included 2 men she recognized from the tribunal and 3 she didn't. The kind of men who wore their violence like cologne, subtle until you got too close. Bobby. Daniel's voice echoed off corrugated metal. I appreciate you agreeing to meet. Family should handle these things privately. Family. Robert's tone could have frozen nitrogen. Is that what we are? The setup was elegant in its simplicity, neutral ground, witnesses from other syndicates to ensure compliance, and a prearranged transfer of Daniel's remaining territorial holdings in exchange for exile. Clean. Bloodless. The kind of mercy that looked like weakness to anyone who didn't understand that Robert's cruelty came in many forms. Nettie had drafted the documents herself, every clause a small knife designed to ensure Daniel would spend the rest of his life knowing he'd been dismantled by paperwork and his brother's patience. She watched Daniel sign, his hand steady, his smile sharp. You always were too clever for violence, Bobby. Father's blunt instrument philosophy never suited you. No. Robert accepted the signed documents, handed them to Chen. It didn't. That's when Nettie noticed the tension in Chen's shoulders. The way his eyes tracked something behind them. The minute shift in his stance that reminded her of the tribunal, of the moment before violence became inevitable. Robert. The first shot came from the rafters, tearing through the space where Robert's head had been a second before. He'd already moved, pulling Nettie down behind a shipping container while gunfire erupted like a symphony conducted by chaos itself. The deal was the distraction. Robert's voice was eerily calm as bullets sparked off metal inches from their position. Daniel never intended to leave alive. He intended for me not to. Nettie's ears rang with the percussion of automatic weapons. She could see Daniel's men advancing, professionals moving with the coordinated efficiency of people who'd done this before. Chen returned fire from behind a fuel truck, his shots measured and deliberate, but he was outnumbered. Robert pressed something cold and heavy into her hands. A gun. Glock 19. She recognized it from the firearms certification the firm had made everyone take after a client stalker incident, but holding it in a conference room was different from holding it while people died 10 feet away. I can't. You can. His hand closed over hers, guiding her grip. Safety's off. Point and pull. Don't think, just react. His eyes found hers, and there was something almost apologetic in them. I'm sorry. I never wanted you to have to. A figure rounded the container, gun raised. Nettie's body moved before her mind caught up, muscle memory from a training she'd never taken seriously, from a world she'd never thought she'd inhabit. The recoil shocked through her arms. The man dropped. She stared at what she'd done, at the blood spreading across concrete, at her hands that were shaking so hard she nearly dropped the weapon. Nettie. Robert's voice cut through her shock. Stay with me. We're not done. More gunfire. More bodies. Chen went down with a grunt that made her stomach lurch, and suddenly it was just her and Robert against 5 men who moved like they'd already won. Robert fought like violence was a language he'd spoken since birth, economical, brutal, each movement flowing into the next with the grace of something choreographed. But even he couldn't be everywhere at once. Nettie fired again. Missed. Fired. Didn't miss. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Just ragged breathing and a smell of cordite and her own pulse hammering in her ears like an accusation. Daniel lay near the hangar entrance, his expensive suit ruined by blood that wasn't all his own. Robert stood over him, gun steady, face expressionless. Bobby. Daniel's voice bubbled wetly. You always were, the better, brother. Robert didn't fire. Just watched his brother's eyes go distant, then empty. Nettie's gun clattered to the floor from numb fingers, and she realized she'd just crossed a line that no amount of legal expertise could ever uncross. She'd killed for Robert Homer. 2 men who'd probably had families, histories, reasons. And the worst part, the part that made her want to vomit, was that she'd do it again if it meant he survived. The cleanup took 6 hours. Nettie watched men in hazmat suits erase a bloodbath like it was routine maintenance, which she supposed in Robert's world it was. Bodies became waste management issues. Evidence became ash. Daniel Homer became a footnote in a ledger that would be shredded by morning. She should have been horrified. Should have been calling the police, the FBI, anyone who could arrest her before she sank deeper into complicity. Instead, she sat in Robert's car with blood under her fingernails and felt something she hadn't experienced in years of partnership track grinding. Power. Real power. Not the performative kind that came from winning depositions or impressing senior partners. The kind that came from understanding that rules were just suggestions enforced by people too afraid to break them. Victor wants to meet. Robert's voice pulled her from the dark calculus running through her mind. Word spread about the hangar. About you. He glanced at her, and something in his expression suggested he was seeing her differently now. They're calling you the Shadow Queen. The lawyer who doesn't just defend monsters, she becomes one. Poetic. Her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. Steady. Cold. Like she'd borrowed Robert's vocal cords. What does Victor want? To test whether tonight was survival instinct or a declaration of intent. Robert's hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers lacing through hers with surprising gentleness. To see if you're really choosing this life or if you're just traumatized and in shock. What do you think? I think, he said carefully, that you're the most dangerous person I've ever met. Because you understand both worlds, the legitimate one that pretends violence doesn't exist, and ours, where violence is just another form of negotiation. You can translate between them. Make us look civilized while burying bodies in legal language. The car pulled up to a restaurant Nettie recognized from Forbes articles about money laundering investigations. Bella Notte. Where the city's elite rubbed shoulders with its criminal infrastructure and pretended not to notice the overlap. Inside, Victor waited in a private room that smelled like cigar smoke and old blood. The other tribunal members flanked him, the Yakuza boss, the triad representative, the woman in Chanel whose name Nettie had learned was Katerina Volkov. They studied her like she was a contract they were considering signing. Ms. Graves. Victor's accent seemed thicker than she remembered. You've had an eventful evening. I've had worse. The lie came easily. At least this time I knew who wanted me dead. Katerina laughed, the sound sharp and approving. She has spine. I like that. Too many lawyers hide behind their briefcases and claim ignorance. We have a proposition. The Yakuza boss, Tanaka, she recalled, leaned forward. Robert's organization needs restructuring after his brother's departure. He needs someone who understands legal frameworks, international finance, and how to make dirty money look clean. Someone the legitimate world will still talk to. You're offering me a job? Nettie felt Robert's hand tighten almost imperceptibly on her knee under the table. We're offering you a seat at this table. Victor gestured to the empty chair between him and Katerina. Consigliera to the entire syndicate. You'd advise on legal matters, handle negotiations, ensure our operations maintain plausible deniability. In exchange, you'd receive a percentage of all major deals and protection from every family represented here. Nettie looked at Robert, searching for guidance, but his face was carefully neutral. This was her choice. Her line to cross. She thought about her corner office 23 floors up, her partnership track, her carefully constructed legitimate life. Thought about 63 employees who'd probably already been laid off, partners who'd fled to the Caymans, and a legal system that pretended justice existed while the powerful rewrote rules in real time. Then she thought about the hangar. The weight of the gun. The way she'd felt watching men fall because she'd decided they should. The intoxicating rush of consequence-free power. 10% of all deals. Her voice didn't shake. And I want immunity documented in writing. If this goes sideways, I walk. Victor's smile could have cut diamonds. Welcome to the shadows, Ms. Graves. Robert's hand on her knee relaxed, And when she glanced at him, she saw something in his eyes that looked dangerously close to pride. Nettie Graves had slapped a mafia boss on a dare and destroyed her legitimate life. Now she was rebuilding it in his image, and the worst part was how right it felt. Thanks watching. Please like, comment and subscribe.